It's a great pleasure to be here. I speak in front of many types of audiences, government audiences in particular, but there's no audience more important than the public, because as I think you're going to see today, public education about some of the new research that we've been conducting on terrorism, especially the type of threat that we face, specifically suicide terrorism, is very important. Many of you know that over the past year, we've devoted another 30,000 troops to Afghanistan. Many of you know that we're spending another $100 billion this year in the war on terror just in Afghanistan alone. To put that in context, that $100 billion that we're spending is more than the federal government spends on educating our children. That $100 billion that we're spending is five times the amount of the worth of the Afghan economy, which the World Bank puts at $22 billion. So it's fair to ask, are we getting our money's worth? Are we more secure today? Are we killing more terrorists than we're producing? Are we better off with all that expenditure of effort? And I think you're going to see that there are some pretty clear answers to those questions. But before I go into our research, you also might be interested to know that if you look at the Pentagon's own report in tracking the progress in Afghanistan, you'd see some very revealing things. Every 6 months, the Pentagon is required by Congress to produce a report called Stability in Afghanistan. The last report was November 2010. This is about a 150-page document, single-spaced, hardly gets any news. If you go and look at that November 2010 report, you'll find out that in the last year, compared to the previous year, overall attacks in Afghanistan, they call them kinetic events, you call them terrorist attacks, are up 73%. 73%. So there's a reason why you're not hearing anyone in the White House and the Pentagon declare victory. There's a reason, which is things are not going well in Afghanistan. The question, though, is why, and do we have better choices? The research we've been conducting at the University of Chicago, I think, will help shed some light on this. It doesn't cover all aspects of terrorism, but it covers one specific aspect of terrorism, suicide terrorism. Why suicide terrorism? Suicide terrorism is the lung cancer of terrorism. Suicide terrorism is the biggest killer in the category. The average suicide attack kills 12 times as many people as the average ordinary attack. Without the element of suicide, the hijackers on 9/11 could never have killed 3,000 people. How do we know? Because in 1993, there was an ordinary terrorist attack against the very same World Trade Center towers where terrorists put a truck bomb in one of the garages in one of the towers to try to bring it down. That killed 6 people. Most people don't even know about that 1993 attack. We certainly didn't turn our country upside down over that 1993 attack. We didn't turn our foreign policy upside down over it. What we're facing, ladies and gentlemen, is not just simply a threat of terrorism, but specifically suicide terrorism. And unless we specifically understand the roots of suicide terrorism, we're not likely to produce policies that make matters better. In fact, we could easily make matters worse. Well, also, though, very interestingly, the analogy to lung cancer, we can carry it forward into research. You see, like a medical researcher studies lung cancer, you can collect information all around the world of who gets suicide terrorism, so to speak, and who doesn't get it in order to better understand the root causes of the phenomenon. And that's the type of research that I do, along with a research team. I started doing this shortly after 9/11, when I compiled the first complete database of all suicide attacks around the world. I published this database as part of an academic article in 2003. When I did that, I knew then that no academic or think tank had such a database, But I was surprised when I got a call from our Department of Defense, because it turned out that our department, our government, like the British government, didn't begin to track suicide terrorism around the world until after 9/11. They had been tracking ordinary terrorism around the world for decades, but not suicide terrorism. And yes, there were some countries who were tracking suicide attacks just against them, such as, say, Israel. But there was no complete database. And our data, as you'll see, goes back to the early 1980s when the modern phenomenon begins. And so the Defense Department was quite eager to get a hold of our data. And in return, they were one of the generous funders of the update and expansion of this project I'm about to tell you about today. And in fact, I'd like you to keep in mind that the Defense Department funded it, because that was the Donald Rumsfeld Defense Department. And in fact, you're going to see that this information really runs quite counter to the policies of the Bush administration. And nonetheless, this was funded not once, but actually several times by the Rumsfeld Defense Department. We're also funded by the Carnegie Corporation in New York, Argonne National Laboratories, and the University of Chicago itself. And what this generous funding has made it possible for me to do is to create the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism, which collects information about suicide attacks all around the world, not just in English, but in the key native languages associated with the phenomenon: Arabic, Hebrew, Tamil, Russian, Urdu. That is, we have a research team who are fluent in these areas. And we don't just simply do this in Chicago. We've also sent people to buy things on, say, black markets in Cairo, Damascus, Beirut, mostly martyr videos. And so what you're going to see here today is not just a compilation of a list of lists, but actually represents the primary source of information that we have on suicide terrorism around the world.